This is going to be a video response to the CDK007 and his video entitled The Problem of Evil. Specifically, it would seem David Hume's argument that an omnipotent, benevolent God is logically inconsistent with the existence of evil. Now, before I begin, it's important to recognize that I'll be defending Christian theism, since the Christian God seems to be the recipient of CDK007's attack. Example, evil coming from an apple would suggest that the Garden of Eden. I'll be making three main points. The first point I'd like to make will rest predominantly in the text description to save time. However, briefly, my first point is in relation to CDK's suggestive imagery in relation to Epicurus, and the seemingly undermining presupposition of hedonism when speaking about the problem of evil. Now, I'm not entirely sure if CDK used Epicurus simply because he was a naturalist, or he actually used some of Epicurus's ideas to make some points. However, such appeals to Epicurean philosophy would be extremely damaging to his position if indeed this is the foundation of his video. Epicurean philosophy is undermining in relation to the problem of evil for two main reasons. First, due to the fact that the exclusive pursuit of selfish pleasure is a main tenet of hedonism, then this could be seen as evil, or a form of evil. And two, hedonism falsely identifies pleasure with good and pain with evil, so we're speaking ethically here. For a detailed response on this first point, see the description. My second point is in reference to David Hume's argument that an omnipotent and benevolent God is incompatible with a world full of evil. CDK007 states it like this, quote, "If God is all-powerful yet chooses not to eradicate evil, then God is benevolent. If God wants to eradicate evil but cannot, then God is impotent. And if God neither wants to eradicate evil nor is able, then why call God God?" End quote. I'm going to treat this argument very quickly since I have a 10-minute allotment. However, I have talked on this topic before, and a more detailed video will be linked in the description. Now, I would like to clarify the alleged contradictions between omnipotence and benevolence with the existence of evil. First, this version of the problem of evil relies on an incorrect definition of omnipotence. The video suggests that omnipotence is the ability to do anything. However, both philosophically and theologically, this is incorrect. Theologically, omnipotence does not equate to the ability to do anything. For example, God cannot lie, Titus 1:2. God cannot cease to be God, Psalm 90, verse 2. Philosophically, omnipotence is not described by free act counterfactuals. Thus, the objection that God's seemingly inability to create a world without evil is contrary to omnipotence, as ignoring the concept of free will decisions by free agents. Thus, if God grants free will, then it is impossible for him to guarantee a nullification of evil, since forcing exclusively good free acts is contradictory to the very notion of free will. Now, I'm aware that the objections to free will existed in his video, and I will deal with those shortly. The second allegation is the alleged contradiction between God's existence and benevolence and the existence of evil. Yet again, this perceived contradiction is erroneous, for it is logical to assume that there are situations where an allowance of evil provides sufficient protection from a greater evil or a greater good, or produces a greater good, excuse me. For example, suppose a woman is hit by a car, which raises the question, why did a benevolent God allow such an event? However, suppose further that the doctors discovered the woman has a tumor near her brainstem, and if she had not been discovered, then she would have died. This simply raises the point that we are not in a good position to say what is and what is not a meaningful or purposeful event or act. This is akin to the philosophical novice suggesting that his professor is wrong on a very elementary point. It is important to note here that the version of the problem of evil that we used was the objection to the logical consistency of God's nature. When we talk about logical inconsistency, in this case an omnipotent and benevolent God with the existence of evil, all one need do to refute the allegation logically is to demonstrate an explanation as logically possible. That explanation does not even have to be plausible or likely. This would suggest a probability argument, and this was not the case. Rather, it just needs to be possible when speaking logically. Now, in light of this fact, the reality of free will and allowance of suffering from some greater good are logically possible explanations, and thus defeat the notion that evil and omnipotent and benevolent God are contradictory. The third point I would like to make is a defense of two of the four theistic responses to the problem of evil. Four counter-arguments were suggested by CDK, namely 1. Good requires evil, therefore without evil there would be no good. 2. A world with evil is better than a world without. 3. Evil is the absence of God. And 4. Free will defense. Now, I'd like to state that I'm not a proponent of 2 or 3, and therefore will be defending number 1 and number 4 respectively. The second counter-argument that's attacked is the notion of free will. Quote, if God created us with the ability to choose for ourselves, then any evil we cause is not of God's doing, end quote. The first objection raised against this argument is as follows. 1, if God knows all things, and 2, if God knows that evil actions will be committed, then 3, therefore, God can be held partially responsible for our actions in light of free will. The issue here is that God's knowledge of our evil actions requires a response on God's part to cease such events, or even the very entrance of evil into the world. However, there are 2 issues with this objection. First, could we also not infer from 1 and 2 that 3, God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting evil in the world, as was discussed in my first point? I see no logical reason that we could not infer such a conclusion. Second, if God were to consistently intervene in the world after every free act, then this would negate free will, since one wouldn't be committing a free act, but would be a pawn in a deterministic world. The second objection raised against free will states that there's no reason that God could not allow free acts with us always siding with good, and he cites heaven as an example. Again, however, heaven is not a good example, for heaven is a place where evil is destroyed, according to Christian theology, wherein creation returns to its initial state, as in the Garden of Eden of innocence. However, I would agree that there could be a possible world wherein human beings always choose a free act that is good. In spite of this, however, if God causes a person to make a specific choice, then this choice is no longer free in the libertarian sense. Rather, genuine freedom to choose implies that, a choice, or in other words, that what we would refer to as agency. Now, see point number 1 about actualizing state of affairs for more clarification in this. The third objection, and the most counterintuitive to CDK's position, in my opinion, is raised against free will, is his adherence to determinism, which is allegedly proven by cognitive neuroscience, he says. Quote, decisions are purely the result of neural activity coursing through the circuitry of our brains. Now, I will be honest here, I'm very surprised that CDK would so readily accept deterministic, materialistic views of the mind-brain discussion. Such an assertion could be a video of it in itself. However, I would like to ignore the mind-brain debate altogether for now and briefly point out 2 major issues with his adherence to determinism regarding human decision. First, if determinism is true, then it's difficult to make sense of moral obligation, prescription, and responsibility. Consider the ethical terminology of ought. If I ought to do something, then it seems to imply that I could do it, indicating choice and ability. For example, no one would say that I ought to jump 30 stairs to save a baby because I can't complete such an action. But assuming determinism to be true, then prescriptive ethical behavior is impossible because I do not have the genuine ability to choose my actions. Thus, on a deterministic view, we could not say that one ought to refrain from torturing babies. Second, determinism is self-refuting and unlivable. Take, for example, this back and forth CDK and I are having. Again, assuming determinism is true and decisions are purely the result of neural activity as CDK suggests, then CDK did not choose to defend determinism and I consequently did not choose to object to it. Rather, this discussion and your viewing of this video are merely the result of heredity and environment. Yet this seems absurd, for it would appear that we could safely be aware of multiple decisions that we individually make every hour. Thus, determinism seems to be unlivable. Moreover, determinism is self-refuting, for the arguments made for determinism are not really arguments at all, but are instead conditional reflexes. Thus, according to H.P. Owen, quote, if the sole reason for my believing or not believing X is that I am causally determined to believe it, I have no ground for holding that my judgment is true or false. Thus, we can conclude that 1, we cannot hold to the ideology that a world with pain and suffering is worse than a world without, since this is relying on Epicurean philosophy, which falsely identifies a pleasure with good and pain with evil. 2, there are good reasons to hold to the existence of an omnipotent and benevolent God and evil. And 3, the objections against free will and the necessary relationship between good and evil are flawed.